When people think about justice in response to crime, they often think prison is it. If you send someone to prison for committing a crime, you've solved the problem of the offense, satisfying the victims and community's need for justice. People think less often about if prison is actually achieving its goal of justice or what justice looks like. Restorative justice is a process and philosophy about responding to harm, not just to crime. When you think about responding to the harm caused, you include the possibility of promoting healing to the victim, rebuilding trust amongst a community that feels violated by the harm, but you're also offering healing to the person who committed the harm through accountability and empowerment to change their lives. In this way, restorative justice holds the power to restore humanity to those who've been harmed, and to the community. But not everyone feels comfortable with this idea. Why should we care about restoring the person who's engaged in crime? Doesn't that let people off easy? Doesn't it show the victim and community that we don't care about them as much as we care about the people who engaged in crime? I used to ask these questions when I began my career as a parole officer. Since my job was to monitor people after they returned home from prison and refer them to services they might need, I wasn't supposed to be in the business of worrying about whether people felt like humans. It seemed to me that they would get there only if they were the perfect parolees. By then, surely they were restored, whatever that meant. But I also felt uncomfortable with the idea that people I was working with were being treated as something other than human. Sure, the goal of parole is to support people in being productive members of society, but my job felt more like I was waiting for people to mess up than I was helping people work toward a good life. In fact, 25% of people who are in prison are there for a parole technical violation, for messing up, like being homeless or relapsing into substance misuse, not for a new crime. The idea of messing up ignored the messiness of people's lives and gave little thought to the worlds they lived in, their experiences in prison, or their lives before they became involved in the justice system. Still, when it came to restorative justice as a possible solution, I was a non-believer. I just can't see how focusing on restoring people's lives would help victims receive justice, people on parole be deterred from committing more crime. Even when I transitioned from being a parole officer to studying for my doctorate in criminology, I was skeptical that focusing on restorative justice would achieve what I thought was supposed to be the primary goal of the justice system, which was to not have people reoffend. But as I studied, the conundrum was that I really cared about the lives of the people who'd been involved in the system. After seeing so many people while in jail and at very low points in their lives, then back in front of a judge hoping for another chance, it was clear that the current system wasn't adequate to help that chance be successful. I believe there was something that could be discovered to help people move away from a life of crime. I've built a body of research focused on the lives of men and women returning from prison, especially the barriers, collateral consequences, and stigma they face. In one study I conducted following men and women for 3 years after being released from prison, I found that despite attaining stable housing, employment, and completing parole, their lives were still in turmoil with unresolved trauma, lack of mental health care, and financial instability. Many still hadn't reunited with family or rebuilt relationships with people in their communities because of the stigma and trauma of incarceration. It was through this work that I began to see something different about how we understood human nature and our current system's responses to it. I became increasingly dissatisfied with the current ways of thinking. Help people find housing, refer to them to treatment, make them hireable, and oh yeah, they should have some social support. But none of these very real needs of people returning home recognize the need for dignity, acknowledgement, and personal agency. Providing people help is essential, but it wasn't enough without showing care, love, and empathy, even from parole officers. The real transformation toward restorative justice for me has come in the last few years. I've had the immense privilege of serving as a volunteer for San Diego's Circles of Support and Accountability, or COSA. COSA is a community-based support group comprised of volunteers who meet with a core member, someone who's returned from prison, typically after a long period of incarceration, for a violent or sexual offense and doesn't have family or friends to return to. COSA is one of the longest running restorative justice programs with research evidence to show that it not only reduces recidivism, but also improves the lives of those involved, including victims. The volunteers surround the core member with support in ways that mirror what it's like to have a tight-knit family or group of friends. Volunteers bring their unique positions and experiences to help the core member reintegrate, and in the process, focus on accountability to the victim and community through healing and restoration. While the focus of the COSA Circle is on the core member, I also experienced a transformation. I was able to see and hear and feel and fully internalize what it means to support restoration of humanity to someone who has caused harm. My recent COSA Circle centered around our core member who'd spent more than a decade in prison, only to be released to the community 2 months before COVID isolated him again. Along with my fellow Circle volunteers, we navigated the pandemic together, as well as providing guidance on how to re-enroll in college, buy a computer, then a car, apply for jobs, and support reuniting with a family member. We got to plan for the future. Experiencing restorative justice practices firsthand has transformed me into a believer. I tell you all of this because I'm a former worker in the legal system who's transitioned into reforming it. I've been involved in a sort of think tank to help develop these ideas around what restorative reintegration means. While this work is still a work in progress, I can share with you some key ingredients for what can make the reintegration process more restorative based on the rich and very real experiences of community members, researchers, practitioners, and people who've been incarcerated. First, restorative justice holds that everyone is deserving of dignity and humanity. No matter the harm, a core principle of restorative justice is that everyone is worthy. Second, recognize that everyone coming home from prison goes through a reentry process. 95% of people who go to prison will return to their communities. It is critical that we recognize the collective experience of reentry and to it provide a collective response. Third, we must acknowledge a person's past trauma and the trauma of being incarcerated in order to center their humanity and the reintegration process and better understand the nature of their needs and how to respond to them. If community members and criminal justice workers, like parole officers, start from this place instead of one where someone might mess up at any moment, we can restore dignity to the reintegration process. Fourth, for reintegration to take place, we assume that people were integrated before they went to prison, that people were previously welcomed and embedded in their home communities. But is that always the case? If not, and I likely suspect it's not, what is the responsibility of the community for supporting integration of its members? Here, restorative reintegration turns the focus to communities and calls upon it to make space for people not just to return, but to come home. Finally, and importantly, restorative reintegration must emphasize the responsibility of the person who caused harm to reckon with that harm and as a result, commit to living their life differently than before. This type of accountability in restorative justice reveals a path for making victims whole, rebuilding relationships with communities, and restoring one's humanity. The men and women you will hear from today embody these principles.